Good afternoon and welcome to Remaking the Economic System, a case study from Puerto Rico. I'm Steve Dubb and I'm a senior editor here at Nonprofit Quarterly. This webinar will conclude our inaugural series of how civil society can make the US economy a more democratic system. You can view the past 6 webinars on our website if you missed them. And I'm hoping our panelists will show themselves for a moment and we'll introduce them. So we're fortunate here to be joined today by Deepak Lamba-Nieves, Research Director for Center for a New Economy, Ruth Santiago, a lawyer who works with a range of clients, including the Comité Diálogo Ambiental, which stands for, or means Committee for Environmental Dialogue, and Livia Rodriguez, the Valle, Executive Director at the Gania Martin Peña Community Land Trust. During this webinar, we will also be showing a video interview in which my colleague, Cindy Suarez, who has made 2 trips to Puerto Rico in the past 18 months, will interview Nelson Colon, who's the president of the Fundación Comunitaria de Puerto Rico, the Puerto Rico Community Foundation. A few notes before we get started. First, we're really excited to take your questions, and we leave a lot of time for your questions. So there's a question box, use it, and we're really looking forward to answering those questions. Second, we will share the slides and the recording with everyone via email after the webinar. So we often get chat messages, will there be slides? And the answer is yes, you will get them. So do not worry. It usually takes us a few days, but you will have them. And finally, we are very happy to offer this webinar free of charge to all of our community. But of course, it is not free to produce these things. So if you can, please consider making a contribution to Nonprofit Quarterly today. So we can continue to bring these brilliant thinkers and exciting topics to all of you. Your donations really do make a difference, and they help us raise additional philanthropic support for our work. You can also support the webinar in series via social media at hashtag Rebuild the Economy. So thanks for being with us today. Again, we'll be having a 5 question survey after the webinar, so keep a lookout for that webinar afterwards, and we're really looking for your feedback. And now I will move to a brief presentation to help frame today's discussion. So with that, we'll move to the first slide. All right, again, this is the culmination of the first year of our Remaking the Economy webinar series, but it won't be our last year. So, and we also have a column called Economy Remix. And so please feel free to give us your ideas as we move forward. And thanks for joining us for this entire series. We really appreciate your support. Next slide, please. And again, this is just a review, but these are some of the objectives of what we're trying to do, both in this series, in the column, and beyond. We hope to be clarifying core principles, developing a toolkit, building understanding of ecosystems of the economy, identifying ways to decolonize wealth and foster racial equity, really looking for points of leverage that can change the economy in a more equitable and democratic direction, as well as shifts in practice and thinking. And we know so many of you are working in the trenches, and so it's important both to have short-term wins now and maintain that long-term vision. And we're talking about changing the economic system here. We chose Puerto Rico to do that because by necessity, because of the bankruptcy, because of Hurricane Maria, this is a community that has to be thinking about a different type of economic system. And it's worth thinking about or understanding sort of what we mean by that. No system is ever total. The United States, for example, right now has a capitalist system, but there are islands of socialism right now in the United States. During feudalism, there were islands of capitalism or proto-capitalist formations. So systems overlap, systems evolve, and new systems typically historically speaking, have emerged out of the shell of the old. And part of what we are featuring here in this system, in this series, sorry, is what we see as potential beginning sprouts, if you will, of an emerging system. And so this is just an overview of who you're going to hear from. So first we'll have the interview from Nelson Colon and talk about an equity approach to Puerto Rico. We'll then move on and Deepak Lampe-Nieves will talk about the role of the state. In his interview, Nelson Colon will also talk about community capital, and then we'll hear from Livia Rodriguez about housing, land tenure, and about really exciting developments in energy from Luis Santiago. Next slide. And obviously, this connects with broader work in the U.S. mainland and elsewhere. And so I just thought I'd highlight here a few of the types of work that we have been featuring at Nonprofit Quarterly over the past couple of years that speak to ways that people are really trying to think about economic development, democratic economies in a different way within the United States. So Justice Funders is a group of philanthropists in the Bay Area. Elizabeth Castillo has written multiple times for Nonprofit Quarterly. She writes from her position at Arizona State. We've written a lot about the rise of community land trusts and worker co-ops, and of course, there's been a lot in the press in the last few months about a Green New Deal. So with that, I'm going to sign off shortly here. And before I do, I just want to say that, this is an interview that's done by my colleague, Cindy Suarez, and she's my fellow senior editor here at Nonprofit Quarterly and has written an amazing series of articles on Puerto Rico. And so it's great to have her.
Welcome to Nonprofit Quarterly's Remaking the Economy webinar series. This episode focuses on Puerto Rico. NPQ has been to Puerto Rico to cover the rebuilding effort. The first time I went in December of 2017, I was invited by a network of nonprofits and spent a few days visiting organizations across the island. And the one thing every single person I spoke with said was that Maria revealed the deep inequities in the island. The Puerto Rico Community Foundation stood out as the only foundation that I know of to date that is explicitly addressing inequity. I know your thinking on this has deepened as you've done the work, Dr. Nelson Colon, so we're eager to hear about your experiences. The first question I have is, what does equity personally mean to you?
I grew up in Ponce, a place where at that point in life, back in the 60s, even getting a good education was a sort of an equity building strategy, given that it was so divided. So it really means a lot for me. And it has given me this particular approach to it, which is about building capital in communities, homegrown capital. So basically, that's where we stand at this point. And it really is a response to what we have been talking for decades about what the problem is.
I notice you've been focusing on ownership, especially collective ownership. You call community ownership, the development of a sort of commons as a strategy. Can you tell us more about what you're learning?
Oh, yeah. First of all, the focus and the emphasis is on collective ownership. And the reason for that is individual ownership is available to anyone. However, collective ownership, it requires a different process of interactions and learnings and tools and skills. So basically, we're looking, for example, at solar communities that will be driven by electrical co-ops, electric co-ops. We're looking at workers-owned corporation that will drive the generation of businesses and employment in communities. And the reason for the collective approach, I mean, it's morally good. It's expressed and highlights solidarity, but it's very practical as well.
So I know that you were recently in DC presenting testimony before the House Committee on Natural Resources. And I'm wondering if you could say more about both your policy goals and something about your strategy.
The main message was the government, it is the responsibility of the government to protect the niche of generation and distribution of energy owned and managed by low-income communities.
And what has been your response to that?
It was a high energy tour, a very positive response for many reasons. One is Puerto Rico could possibly be a social innovation learning space for any Green Deal that can be thought of in the U.S. So we have three very powerful examples. One is we launched the first income community in Toro Negro. They were paying an average of $60 a month, which is pretty much 10% of the income of a pensioner in Puerto Rico. So they were paying close to 60, and that came down to 3.
Wow.
And yeah, that's basically the impact of that. Eventually, that will stabilize, and we are projecting that the cost of their energy will be more around $20 per month. So essentially, that means that you will be going down from 60 to 3, and then you will somewhat end up in the range of 20. But the second example is powerful as well. And the second example focuses on providing backup energy to health clinics in Puerto Rico. We have 68 health clinics in Puerto Rico. We have covered so far with backup solar system 37. So we're pretty much in the midpoint. So we have the capacity of covering all 68 clinics in Puerto Rico if the resources are available. And we are in the finalizing stage of a proposal with the federal government. They have invited us to energize the island of Culebra. If that project, or when that project comes to fruition, it will be the first island in the Americas totally energized by solar. So those three examples give us very solid grounds and pillars for envisioning the green corridor in Puerto Rico, and that's the vision. That's the next goal.
I know you started with energy and water and healthcare to the work that you're doing with the clinics, and some housing. I'm wondering if that kind of covers what you're looking to, so this other focus of focusing on equity is focusing on particular aspects that no one should be without. Correct? Is that what you're?
Yeah, absolutely. And one way of thinking of community capital is looking at those 5 or 6 areas of assets. And the most obvious one are financial assets or infrastructural assets, referring to schools, referring to community centers, referring to houses, all hard assets that are based in a community. But beyond that, then you have human capital or human assets. So you need to look at the development of talents. You need to look at training people. You need to look at education. You need to look at health. But also, in addition to that, you have what we call environmental assets. You have been in Puerto Rico, you know of the beauty of Puerto Rico. The people from Costa Rica, they are the masters of working with their environmental assets and transforming that into income for the social good. And then you have the cultural assets. I mean, so you think of Loiza, for example, and the riches they have regarding the Afro-Caribbean culture in Puerto Rico is just extraordinary. Part of the process is to work with communities and make them aware of the kind of assets and capital that they already have. It's a matter of growing that capital that is already existing in our communities in Puerto Rico.
How did you come to that comprehensive list?
Basically, it's an emerging strategy. It's a strategy that emerges from experience, that emerges from working in communities. So it is a framework that in the best scenario, the 6 assets of capital working together will lead any community to a radical transformation.
What would equity in Puerto Rico look, feel, sound, smell like?
It will look like young people and children in Loíza, for example, which is one of the poorest, if not the poorest town in Puerto Rico, walking to their schools, receiving a quality education. It will look like boys and men of color in Loíza, which is about close to 80%, will be developing their own businesses, will be generating employment for their own communities. It will mean also active participation in community affairs, active participation in governments, local governments affairs. So it means a bright future for all. That's essentially what it means. It means collective prosperity. It means that people will feel that they're in their own communities, they have access, as everyone else, for quality resources of society. That's basically what equity means for me. That would be my vision.
Oh, I love it. So the last question is, how can philanthropy in Puerto Rico make a difference without getting in the way?
Yeah. First, philanthropy needs to make a very deliberate choice about investing in equity designs, in equity strategies. And secondly, supporting this whole notion of engaging the federal government in funding some of these initiatives. I mean, the magnitude of some of these initiatives are beyond the capacity of philanthropy. But philanthropy could easily be the innovator. I would look forward for philanthropies and foundations from the U.S. coming forward and joining forces in building and developing the Green Corridor in Puerto Rico. That will be a home run for philanthropy.
Why? Why would it be a home run?
First, because that will be an extraordinary option for social innovation. That will be tangible proof of collective power. And thirdly, it will be an example for the future of power generation in the world. In a way, this could be a learning experience for the whole field of philanthropy.
Wow. Well, thank you so much for offering so much. Thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you so much.
Well, first of all, thank you to Nonprofit Quarterly for the opportunity. And I just want to provide a little bit of background. The Center for New Economy is a nonprofit independent think tank focused on advancing progressive policy solutions based on solid research. Now, I want to start off by showing you a very revealing graph that summarizes Puerto Rico's economic situation from 2006 until 2017, a period some of us in the island call or refer to as our lost decade. As you can see, it's not an unwarranted or overtly dramatic label, given that since 2006, all major macroeconomic indicators, including population, economic activity, investment, and employment, have plummeted. Now, behind these numbers lies another story that underscores the hardships that most Puerto Ricans face. Median yearly income in the island is a third of that in the US, and 43.5% of people live in poverty. That is double the rate of Mississippi, the poorest state of the Union. Inequality has also been on the rise, and unfortunately, Puerto Rico today is one of the most unequal societies in the world. Next slide, please. Now, these trends have raised an important challenge for our organization, the Center for a New Economy. In 2016, we sort of came up with the Growth Commission, the CNE Growth Commission, a group of local and global experts who, through research and policy advocacy, could help define a comprehensive development framework for Puerto Rico that could serve to jumpstart the economy and chart a sustainable path forward. Now, that was before the storms. And before the storms, the Growth Commission had outlined an ambitious agenda covering a lot of ground. But after the storms, everything changed, not just at the center, but in most areas in Puerto Rico. And we have, sought to revise our agenda to account for the long journey that will be the island's reconstruction. We've honed in on basically a set of broad areas that are both central to the reconstruction process, critical to long-term development, and where we think that there will be a significant amount of recovery dollars and public investments made. And these three areas are energy, housing, and fiscal rules. Next slide, please. I won't dwell too much on energy or housing because I know my colleague Ruth and Livia will focus on some of these issues. But I want to say that in the case of energy, the availability of high quality, reliable, and cost-effective electric power is of strategic importance to the future economic development of Puerto Rico. Now, ironically, the devastation caused by Hurricane Maria to Puerto Rico's electric power infrastructure provides an opportunity to actually modernize and redesign the entire system. One possible path forward for this modernization process would be to, one, upgrade the transmission and distribution grid to adapt it to the new generation technologies that are being incorporated into the system. Two, maximize the installation of new generation based on renewable energy sources. Three, possibly maintain but not increase the generation capacity already existing using natural gas. And four, progressively retire these generation units that use diesel coal 100% of its electricity with renewable sources by 2050, and basically at significant lower rates than those prevailing today. On the housing front, the government of Puerto Rico has delineated a series of strategies for meeting the post-disaster housing needs on the island, which include things like granting legal titles to homes, repairing and rebuilding housing units, relocating families out of flood zones, building new dwellings, rehabilitating abandoned buildings, and even developing a complete and updated property registry. Now, the problem is that the aggregate of these strategies does not constitute a comprehensive framework for the housing sector in Puerto Rico. Now, given the situation, the Center for a New Economy established the Blueprint Initiative as a program of the Growth Commission. And it's a research and knowledge exchange and advocacy platform that hopes to bring together existing efforts and strategic thought partners to come up with a collective roadmap for the reconstruction and beyond. The Blueprint Initiative aims to leverage CNE's research and policies advocacy expertise and build outreach campaigns, scholarly projects, and policy solutions in conjunction and collaboration with key stakeholders in the islands, focusing on three main areas: land tenure, housing affordability, and safe housing. The third topic the Growth Commission is focusing on is fiscal rules. Now, fiscal rules can be broadly defined as mechanisms that allow for the establishment of monitorable fiscal targets and strategies. These rules have become popular since the 1990s and are currently a common feature in countries throughout Europe, Asia, and Latin America. Now, during the early months of 2016, CNE recommended the adoption of a fiscal responsibility law for Puerto Rico as an alternative to the Promesa bill that was being discussed in Congress, which brought us the unfortunate control board in Puerto Rico. Now, while the fiscal responsibility law proposal actually garnered support from key government officials from the two major political parties in the island, the adoption of the Promesa bill in the summer months of 2016 shifted all policy discussions towards the sweeping fiscal reforms that people expected the control board would usher in during its tenure. 3 years after the control board was established, very little has changed with regards to the adoption of budget and spending controls and the transformation of the island's financial systems. As we predicted, the Commonwealth government has dragged its feet or completely ignored the fiscal dictates that have been established and imposed by the board, and public support for the board has waned considerably. Now, in this environment, the adoption of a fiscal responsibility law seems more relevant than ever, since it provides an opportunity for local policymakers and our local elected officers in Puerto Rico to take the initiative and craft a creative yet feasible response to the political stalemate and the fiscal crisis. Now, on the last slide, I would like to end with what has now become the central tenet or the motto of the Growth Commission and the CNE. And it's basically this, that it seems clear that how Puerto Rico recovers from the disasters will determine how the island grows. With that, I'll open the floor to my other colleagues. I'm happy to answer any questions you might have, because I know I sweep through a bunch of information in a short amount of time.
So Deepak, thanks so much. That was Deepak Lambaniewas from Center for New Economy. And now we have Ruth Santiago, who will, from Centro Diálogo Ambiental. And Ruth, take it away.
So hi, everyone. Happy to be participating in this webinar. Thank you for tuning in. I work with community and environmental groups, mostly in southeastern Puerto Rico, but also at Puente de Williamsburg, which has an office in San Juan. And what you see in this first slide is a map of Puerto Rico with an overlay of the electric grid and also the plants. And so it looks probably pretty confusing, and it is. It was designed for a totally different reality from what we have now. The big plants are in the south, lots of generation in the south, about 3/4 of the generation in the south, and then the demand is in the north. So those big blue lines, the transmission lines, are what basically Hurricane Maria took down, and other hurricanes have impacted as well as the distribution system. Hopefully, what we've learned in terms of the electric system, which has been referred to as the commanding heights of the economy, is that Puerto Rico is part of the Caribbean, so-called continental islands, and it's in the hurricane route. That vertical poles, transmission towers, and lines crossing the central mountain range and the tropical forests don't hold up very well to hurricane force winds. That solar installations, especially rooftop solar, hold up much better, and that communities need to participate in the electric power generation and other energy issues. So we're proposing a transformation. I work with, as I mentioned, different community and environmental and civil society groups, and the transformation that we are proposing is based on studies done by faculty at the University of Puerto Rico at Mayagüez Technical Campus that indicate, for example, that using 65% of the residential rooftops could generate all of the Puerto Rico's energy demand back in 2009 when energy demand was much higher. And also studies from NREL indicating that certain contaminated areas like closed landfills might also be used. But certainly, because of the limitation on land in Puerto Rico and in most islands, we cannot have sprawling solar farms or wind farms because, for example, the southern coastal plain is at its widest about 15 miles wide, and it has the most available space on the islands because the northern coast has been developed more. So there are foundations for this proposal that we are part of, known as We Want Sun. You can find it online at the website indicated on the slide. The Spanish translation is Queremos Sol. So what we found is that studies indicate that there's a lot of viability for doing 100% renewables very soon, very quickly. We have found that the combination, right? So we're not talking about just a techie solution and slapping renewable or energy installations onto rooftops or close to the point of use, but a combination of energy literacy programs, demand response programs like time of use rates, also energy efficiency, of course, and PV systems, for example, coupled with battery energy storage systems and power electronics or smart grid technology will definitely provide for all of the energy needs of Puerto Rico and other places as well. Also, there's a recent publication by one of the faculty members at the UPR at Mayagüez indicating that small solar kits can provide for the critical household needs that will could very well save lives, contrary to what happened in the aftermath of Hurricane Maria. Next slide, please. So the viability, in addition to the technical viability, we have found that rooftop solar is economically viable, and those are not our words. They are the words of Siemens Industry, which has drafted what is known as the Integrated Resource Plan for the Puerto Rico Electric Power Authority, indicating that all customer-owned generation alternatives would be cheaper than the PREPA preferred plans in the Integrated Resource Plan. So, but incredibly, in spite of this, the customer-owned solar option is severely limited to only 10% of the generation mix by 2038, which is the end of the planning period for which the IRP is drafted. And so this is incomprehensible if, on the one hand, there's an admission by the technical experts that customer options like rooftop solar are cheaper than options from the grid, like, for example, the transmission system. The problem with the reason behind that is that transmission is, as we said, very difficult in Puerto Rico and very expensive and requires a lot of maintenance and a lot of investment. And so rooftop solar makes a lot more sense because you can basically cut that expense out, and to a large extent, distribution line expenses as well. Next slide, please. Oh, and the economic viability, of course, can be enhanced by financing from the local credit unions, which is the lender of, the common folk here and the lower and middle classes. And unfortunately, what we're seeing is that the government is actually, although there has been, I would say, lip service and actually a statute and a renewable portfolio standard that sets a goal of 100% renewables by 2050. But unfortunately, what we're seeing is the planning, the actual investments are going into all of this LNG infrastructure or methane gas infrastructure, which the government is trying to bring from the states, basically what is known as frack gas, impacting those communities, and then bringing it here to Puerto Rico, where it would impact local communities in detrimental ways, as opposed to our options, which we outline in the Queremos Sol platform, that talk about solar communities and community participation in generation as prosumers, right? Not just passive consumers, but active participants in the energy generation. Thank you.
Thank you, Ruth. And I will now introduce Livia Rodriguez de Valle from Martin Peña, Caño Martin Peña Community Land Trust. Thank you. Livia, go ahead.
Hi, thank you so much for the opportunity to share a little bit of our experience with the audience. I have to start by going back to something Deepak said, which is that even prior Hurricanes Irma and Maria, Puerto Rico did not and still does not have a comprehensive set of policies regarding housing issues and habitat as a comprehensive unit. Rather, the policies that the Puerto Rican government was implementing or has been implementing for a very long time are those related to subsidies, mainly subsidies from the U.S. federal government via several programs, and the guidelines to be able to comply with them. Therefore, there has been a disinvestment in terms of public funds for housing or the stimulus of housing from the public sector, and more of channeling this issue through private development. With in the years closer to this, a total disregard to the city made by the people or to the housing made by the people, what is called the quote-unquote informal settlements and informal construction. Next slide, please. So with Hurricane Maria, one of the examples of this issue has been precisely that of land titling and property rights and land tenure. Approximately 60,000 families were denied FEMA assistance in the aftermath of Hurricane Maria precisely because they didn't have documentation that could prove that they had any property rights to the house where they were living, causing severe consequences for many. The picture that you are looking at is the area of the Caño Martín Peña, where still today, 18 months after Hurricane Maria, we see hundreds of families that are living under a blue tarp. So in this context, the federal government has allocated CDBGDR funds to Puerto Rico. Out of the total funds allocated, $8.3 billion in CDBG disaster recovery funds are being managed by the Puerto Rico Housing Department, and an action plan has been approved by HUD for these funds. They include $40 million for a title clearance program, which is focusing on the regularization of land titling and dealing with the legal issues associated to that, rather than having a more comprehensive look at tenure and the security of tenure, meaning the possibility that people have access to safe, decent housing and not fear for displacement. So one of the challenges precisely of the overall CDBGDR investment is that the policies that have been adopted by the government of Puerto Rico will result in the end in displacing the poor rather than supporting on-site mitigation and the reduction of vulnerabilities whenever feasible. This can be illustrated, again, in a twofold way in terms of individual land rights. People receiving individual titles to their homes if they do not own the land, for example, in areas that are currently subject to land grabs and real estate pressures will be more vulnerable to selling the land at underpriced levels and then staying in similar harsh living conditions but having to move elsewhere. And then the other example is the prohibition of the, in accordance to the action plan, for communities residing within the floodplain to be able to rebuild the new house within the floodplain, even when they apply mitigation strategies. This is a policy that is not used in the United States. Actually, the regulations that for the CDBGDR funds do allow for the reconstruction in the floodplain as long as mitigation strategies are included. But in the case of Puerto Rico, the government is prohibiting such reconstruction. Now, this will have an unequal impact, particularly in low-income communities and those where we have the highest concentration of the Afro-Puerto Rican population, for example. And these policies, which might sound as important policies in the light of climate change, have the problem that are only being applied to the use of the CDBGDR funds, which are meant to address the needs of the poor. However, on the same token, the government of Puerto Rico continues to approve permitting for new construction and reconstruction in the same floodplains throughout the island. Next slide, please. So one of the things that the community land trust that has been created by the areas in settlements along this tidal channel, which is located at the heart of the San Juan metropolitan area, is to provide an option to individual land titling as a way not only to regularize land tenure, but also a means to prevent gentrification in areas such as this. Located at the heart of the San Juan metropolitan area, the environmental recovery of the Martin Peña tidal channel will definitely increase land values in the area and eventually be the cause of gentrification. Now, the communities along the Caño Martin Peña opted to create a community land trust. So rather than acquiring individual property titles to the land, they currently collectively own over 200 acres of strategically located land. So this is a way in which you can not only protect the community against gentrification through collective land ownership, but also recognize individual property rights through surface rights, separating the collective ownership from the individual ownership of the right to the structure and the plot of land where that structure is built. Next slide, please. So again, this is a very important instrument because it can provide examples, or it does provide examples of alternative ways of dealing with land tenure that are not only focused with the legal aspect of acquiring documentation to the land, but rather it's an instrument that is contextualized in a comprehensive development plan that was developed by the residents of the area. So these sort of collective land tenure mechanisms, in this case, the community land trust, benefits the residents because now not only are there no absentee owners, which is how the government agencies that used to be owners of the land behaved in the past, but also it takes out of politicians the power to decide who they will actually give out individual land titles, avoiding those political clientelism. It also empowers the community and fosters participatory democracy. So in the case of Martin Peña, these neighborhoods are the largest landowner in all of this region of San Juan. And it also becomes a mechanism to distribute wealth. The city gets benefits as well in terms of the community land trust model for this purposes, as it secures long-term affordability in housing, facilitates urban reform with the support of the community, and rather than displacing the poor elsewhere, which is where CDBGDR policies are currently focused, it deals with poverty in place without destroying community cohesion. So basically what we want to exemplify with the Caño Martin Peña experience is the importance and relevance of community engagement and participation in the discussion around habitat and housing issues, rather than dealing with individual families in an individual way, which will definitely continue to have families live under poverty conditions and disconnected from their communities and their social infrastructure, which has proven to be so critical during emergencies and disasters such as Hurricane Maria, that there are other ways of achieving this, but also construct citizenship and construct the basis for a more equitable society in Puerto Rico moving forward. Thank you.
So thank you. And we'll all join in a second here, I think. And so thanks for covering such a wide range of issues. By the way, I know a few of you on the phone, on the webinar have already put in your questions, and there's some really excellent questions. We will get to them and keep them coming. So I'll start with a question for Deepak. And, you know, the numbers that get bantied about in terms of allocations to Puerto Rico, you know, are there's a big range, and you know, as high as 91 billion, right? How much has actually gone to Puerto Rico, and why is it so much less than the amount advertised? And you know, what's holding up the recovery in that sense?
Well, for those of you who have heard the President of the United States talk about Puerto Rico and this disaster funding, you'll hear a figure of 91 billion. Now, the 91 billion figure is not correct with regards to what has actually gotten on the ground in Puerto Rico. In fact, the latest figures that we have from FEMA, in fact, who has been trying to scrounge up all the different numbers from numerous agencies. And keep in mind, the reason why coming up with the figure is so hard is for two main reasons. One, the appropriations process in the US Congress is a highly complex one. And two, you have multiple agencies, federal agencies, that intervene in the aftermath of disasters. So coming together and pulling together all those pieces of information becomes a sort of a detective's task. Now, FEMA's tried to do this, and I'm basically going to recite some of the figures that are current as of March 31st, the end of March 31st, 2019. Puerto Rico has been allocated $42.29 billion in disaster assistance fund through 17 different federal agencies. The total allocated amount, $20 billion, has been obligated. And of those obligations, only $12.62 billion has been dispersed, actually has touched the ground in Puerto Rico. It's about $12 billion. Now, touch the ground in Puerto Rico does not mean that these programs have been rolled out by the government of Puerto Rico. But what is actually under the control of local Puerto Rico agencies amounts only to $12 billion. Where does the 91 billion figure come from? Several journalists have tried to answer this question. They've run it through the fact checker ringer. And so they figured out, and through conversations with the Office of Management and Budget, the Federal Office of Management and Budget, is that 42 billion or 41 billion back then was what the federal government had allocated. And they expect, and this is somewhat suspect, they expect that to roll out 50 billion in the future. So if you add 50 plus 41 gives you 91, right? So this is a very speculative number, this 50 billion number. And 91 billion, even 91 billion is not, as the president says, the largest rollout of federal funding for disaster recovery. Katrina, just to give you a sense, cost approximately $120 billion, and most of it went to Louisiana. So keeping things in perspective and being very clear about the numbers is important, because Puerto Rico has not seen $91 billion come to its coffers. It's only about 12 billion have arrived in the island, and not even that same amount has actually gotten to the people who need it the most.
Great, thanks, Deepak. Let's see, Livia, I wanted to ask about, well, I think maybe I'll combine a couple questions, but both, how do you regularize title? Because that's part of what, the work, there's a lot of irregular title in Puerto Rico, and what are some of the alternatives to displacement that you're working with, and what they look like?
Yeah, so in terms of the regularization of titles, it is important to know that the legal structure in Puerto Rico is more similar to that of Louisiana. Therefore, according to our legal structure, a person can own a property without having the document. The purpose of the document is to provide publicity, to let others know, like banks, for example, that who is the owner of that property. So the fact that somebody does not have access to a document or does not have a document that proves property does not mean that that person does not have ownership or property rights on it. So in terms of the regularization of titles or dealing with that issue, definitely it's a legal matter. It depends on dealing with successions, for example. If there is somebody that died and has several heirs, and then there are heirs after that, and they haven't done the work afterwards to clear up their documentation, what we're going to get is many people with property rights without documents. So that's a legal aspect regarding title clearance. However, when dealing with land tenure, it's a broader question other than the document that proves ownership rights to a property in particular. And even getting those documents can be extremely expensive. It requires legal assistance, but it also requires paying dues to other professionals in the process, and it might also require going through permitting processes as well in government agencies. What we are proposing is the importance to see the way in which title and land ownership rights are regularized, particularly when dealing with informal settlements quote unquote, or those settlements whose origin was not through a formal urbanization process, but rather through different historical processes like the Caño Martín Peña communities, which are settlements that occurred in the 1930s when migrants moved into the urban areas and created the land where there were wetlands, for example. So in those particular areas, the people never had legal documentation to the land. And in those cases, we have over 120 communities in Puerto Rico with that sort of problem. In those cases, it is critical that the regularization of land tenure is looked as a mechanism that will take that community be where they want to be moving forward into the future. So this cannot be seen only in terms of the documentation of a particular family, but rather the fact that the way in which tenure is handled can have an impact moving forward. And this ties us up with the discussion regarding displacement in particular, because what we have been seeing in Puerto Rico, particularly after Hurricane Maria, but obviously this was a trend prior to that, is massive migration of Puerto Ricans to the United States, which is something that Deepak signaled on his presentation. Therefore, we do have other people coming into Puerto Rico and buying real estate at very cheap prices. So we're seeing sort of land grabs, particularly in coastal areas or other areas that can be suitable for development and real estate development in the future. And what if we don't take these issues into consideration when dealing with land tenure in a regularization process? What we can do is make communities more vulnerable to these other processes of gentrification and land grabs moving forward. And then rather than having an equitable result and investing in reducing vulnerability in these communities, we will end up moving poverty elsewhere or making it impossible for Puerto Ricans to live in Puerto Rico in the long run. So that is an important tie between ownership and displacement and how to prevent that and address the issues of development in a more comprehensive and participatory way.
Great, thanks, Livia. Ruth, I wanted to ask you about obviously the electrical system and, what is needed to transform the Puerto Rican electrical system to better serve the public interest, and talk about the role of solar. In some ways, it seems it's natural. There's lots of sun in Puerto Rico, and is that a resilient? Are solar panels resilient in the case of a hurricane? That was the question that got thrown in by the audience. What do you have to do to make sure that when there is a hurricane, that the solar panels are easily repaired, et cetera?
Yeah. Okay. So probably people are aware that ratepayers in Puerto Rico pay the second highest electric rate of any U.S. jurisdiction. Islands have very specific issues with respect to energy generation, transmission, distribution, etc. And so those high rates actually make solar a great option, right? Because we know now that the economic viability is there, especially for the islands, because of how much more expensive it is to do methane gas projects or LNG projects. Even just all conventional fuels, have to be shipped in, and all those costs and all the volatility related to those costs make solar economically viable. And also, we know that this technology is now available to allow ratepayers and consumers to become, active participants in the system. But it's a combination of things that are needed. We really do need a lot of energy literacy education about how we first make residences and businesses very energy efficient, very able to use solar make the best use of solar at the right times, and therefore minimize the need for battery energy storage systems. And in fact, one of our proposals is to have sort of a resource center for solar communities and solar initiatives to achieve some level of energy democracy in Puerto Rico. And so get away from this model, big central station fossil fuel generation model with long distance transmission from the south to the north that is not resilient, not reliable, and not healthy, not good for public health or the finances of Puerto Rico, right? So the island has, in some years, invested as much as $3 billion per year. So I think one of the things that the center could help with would be you have an information sharing process. So we have a few groups doing solar projects sort of in isolation right now and not necessarily being able to share the experiences and in the information and not being able to propagate enough, what they're learning and what they're implementing. So we need that information sharing. We need to have a centralized place where people can go, communities can go and find out how they can garner the information and how they can create sort of the financing structure, right, to handle the upfront costs related to solar investments, because we know that's one of the big issues everywhere, right? And as Deepak said, with median incomes being 1/3 those of the U.S. mainland, we really need, so for example, maybe like loan guarantees for local credit unions to be able to make these loans for solar communities, and these solar kits that the faculty at the University of Puerto Rico have designed that to be able to handle at least the critical loads within each household, so that medical needs are met, so that the elderly are tended, and so that everyone has enough at least to power, the critical needs. So there are lots of issues related to solar. It's not, all that simple, but certainly the option is not to do the so-called transition with gas. We already have in our energy mix close to 40% of gas generation that, we can go eliminating in first order, where we're working very intensively to eliminate the energy generation from coal combustion, coal burning. Very problematic in Puerto Rico because the AES coal burning power plant has no disposal facility, for example, for its coal ash waste, and it's contaminated the South Coast aquifer. So we need to eliminate those fossil fuel plants and go quickly to community solar options and rooftop options or use options close to the demand.
Great, thanks, Ruth. That's really.
Sure.
Livia, I wanted to ask about, what is the housing situation of folks? I mean, I understand some folks are still living under blue tarps. This can't go on forever, obviously. How do you deal with that?
Yeah, so that's a great question. We still have thousands and thousands of families living under blue tarps. Now you can imagine with the Caribbean heat, what that is like at noon, just standing in that sea of blue, and what that is worth then that is standing a heavy rainfall like the ones we've had in the past weeks, with tarps that are already 18 months old, and that people shouldn't be living under them more than 12 months. So this is a crisis, and it should be dealt with as a crisis and as an emergency. Unfortunately, the rules to deal with the situation of housing that are being currently applied are the ones of business as usual and not the ones of emergency housing. Unfortunately, as well, the STEP program that was implemented by FEMA and the Department of Puerto Rico Housing Department was not effective in terms of being able to use those funds to adequately provide roofing to these tens of thousands of families. So some of the things that I think should be done first is the recognition that there is still an emergency going on in terms of housing, therefore flexibility in the rules that will be applied for building roofs. One of the issues that some of the people that are building roofs have confronted is precisely that they're being required to have all the construction permits. Now, because half of the housing stock in Puerto Rico was self-built, no architect or engineer will certify that construction was done in compliance with the regulations, and therefore you will never get a permit to build a roof. So those are the very basic steps of the process that make it very hard for the common persons to actually engage in assisting their neighbors in having a decent roof in their homes in the meantime, or at least as an emergency measure. The other thing is that CDBG funds cannot be used for repairs if the families are living again in the floodplain. And I have to address this because the floodplain in Puerto Rico was increased by 25% because of the adoption of FEMA advisory maps, as if they were the maps that are supposed to be generated through a peer reviewed process, and this is not the case. Therefore, we have a very significant part of our population that is living under in floodplains and cannot have access to funds, even federal funds, to repair their homes. So people are doing this with whatever income and resources they have, and if we continue to treat this not as an emergency, what we will have is what we're seeing. People are just trying to get this whatever scrap material they're able to find, and little by little try to make some minor repairs to their homes, ending up with, again, highly vulnerable housing and situations. So I guess that in the other end, something that can be done is for professionals in the fields of architecture, engineering, and so forth to continue to help communities understand better construction techniques and make them available to the common to the people that need it, and again for the government just to make the process easier. As we definitely need access to materials at a reasonable cost, which is another huge issue currently, as is the one of labor. And finally, I want to stress that the population of Puerto Rico has grown older, significantly older. The youth are immigrating. One of the things that we're seeing is that most of the people that are still living under TARP are elderly people that have no family members or other structures to assist them in this process. So we need to take note of that reality and ensure that the funds that are coming into Puerto Rico will come to Puerto Rico, get to deal with those issues in the first place.
Great, thanks, Livia. I think I want to go to some audience questions, and a lot of really good ones have come in. One was really to ask the question that Cindy asked Nelson Colon, which was, how can philanthropy help without getting in the way? So always there's a need for resources, and with resources often come strings that aren't necessarily helpful. So, anybody who wants to jump in and sort of, how can philanthropy actually be supportive without, screwing things up even more? Yeah.
I'll take an initial stab at the question. I think that the first is recognizing that there's already a great group of organizations on the ground in Puerto Rico that have been doing the work for many, many years. And the recognition that their agendas and their processes and their ways of executing may be different from those of United States funders, but nonetheless, they get the job done, right? And so recognizing that there's a great group of organizations is task number one. You just heard from Ruth and Livia. These are exemplar organizations in the island that can provide a great service to on-the-ground communities in ways that nobody else that can come parachuting in from the United States can. So I think that that's step number one. I think the other is tied to that. Is sort of understanding that we don't need funding in drips and drabs, right? We require sustained investment. This recovery is going to go on for the better part of a decade or even more. So I understand that funding cycles are small, that funders' attention and funder impact, they want to see impact in the immediate to short term, but I think that they need to expand their horizons. The crisis in Puerto Rico has been in the making for decades. And I just showed you numbers on the last decade and how bad it has been for the people of Puerto Rico. So one 1 or 2 year commitments from foundations is not necessarily going to move the needle, and that's going to be an excuse for them to perhaps say, well, we shouldn't put more money into Puerto Rico. I think a change in attitude is needed. I think long-term commitments that at the same time that you're recognizing the work already being done, you can also step in meaningful ways to provide the technical assistance that we actually need. The kind of help that actually helps organizations on the ground do their job better. I'm not saying that we have every lesson learned, we have nothing to learn. We have a lot to learn. So where we look is also important. But usually we want to look into places in the United States. Maybe there are great experiences of reconstruction outside the United States. And so we don't necessarily have to reproduce the models of community development and or of community reconstruction that we've seen in the US. There's disaster unfortunately happen all over the world, and there's lessons to be learned from them. So when we think about possible solutions and learning exchanges, we also have to look beyond the United States model to see places and to understand the places where they've done this right.
Great, thanks, Deepa. Anything, Ruth or Olivia, that you want to jump in quickly?
Sure. Yeah, I totally agree. Connect with the groups who are already on the ground doing the work. Do your homework. I mean, for example, in the energy sphere, I would say go to our website, queremosolpr.com. It's a pretty good background information and guide for what of the vision and the objectives and the transformation that community, civil society here believes will be the way to transform our electric system to best serve the public interest here. So yeah, I would totally agree with being very clear about what is being done currently.
Great, thanks. Another question that came from the audience. Nelson Colon in his interview talked about the need for, I think the phrase was a radical transformation. And, how does that play out politically, and how do you, effectively, engage in a decolonization process that's obviously so needed?
Can I start with that?
Yeah, go for it.
Okay, so we currently have, I think, the best example of what might be called energy coloniality. There is a glut of, as we know, a methane gas known as fracked gas, and others call it natural gas, in the U.S., right? So there's this overproduction from using this very controversial, and high-impact technology to extract gas and oil. And that glut, the plan is apparently, and the government here, unfortunately, is collaborating with that proposal to bring that gas to Puerto Rico to do a so-called transition. And as mentioned earlier, the electric system is such a large part of the economy. And making it dependent again on another fossil fuel will not help matters. It will not create like the multiplier effect we need here to have more local wealth stay on the island. And so I think we really need to use our local resources and have local communities develop them with the help of the nonprofit sector and other groups, academia, businesses, etc., but certainly not become the market for that glut of natural gas or fracked gas that is available in the U.S.
Great,
we can avoid energy coloniality a bit that way.
Olivia, you want to jump in?
I was just saying that what Ruth is saying does not only apply to the energy sector, it's pretty much across the board. And it ties up to the previous question and Deepak's comments in terms of how and the U.S. non-for-profit and foundation sector can approach Puerto Rico in a respectful way and taking the time to learn and learn what the local landscape is, and also the richness of the work that is going on in the grassroots level. I would also want to add that the support to community organizing is critical if we want to talk about a decolonial agenda for Puerto Rico. We need to stimulate critical thinking. We need to continue to stimulate grassroots organizing and other ways to organize society beyond what has been going on traditionally over the past decades. So for those interested in investing on precisely organizing beyond mobilization, but rather for social transformation and critical thinking is crucial if Puerto Rico is to move beyond the colonial status that it currently holds.
Great, thanks. Well, you sort of anticipated the next question from the audience, which was about what is there a role for advocacy by social movements for the agendas that you're promoting, whether it be fiscal policy, energy, or land tenure?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Go for it.
Yeah. We definitely, as I mentioned, so we know about the economic viability of the transformation that we need. We know about the technological viability of it, but it's not generally out there. I mean, certainly people now in Puerto Rico are much more energy literate. People even know the number of their transmission line, and they know if that line goes out, that they're not going to have power. So there's been an amount of public information out there about these issues that have such great impacts on communities. But we need to do a lot more. We need to do advocacy and be very clear, because as I said, we have this new energy public policy law signed last month that talks about this incredible, 100% renewable energy goal by 2050. And, it sounds, and some have even dubbed it as the Green New Deal, but when you look at it closely, and you need to do advocacy to look at it, to get people to see it as it is, for what it is, what you see is this huge investment for LNG infrastructure. The law actually provides that any private investor that buys up one of the generation units within 5 years has to convert those plants to dual fuel, to burn basically oil, which they burn now, and gas. And that is disastrous for renewable energy investments. That goes contrary. So, the law, we need to do a lot of advocacy. We have been doing that with almost no resources. So, yeah, it would be great to have resources to really make clear what the issues are about the energy transformation that we need here.
Great, thanks. Deepak?
I wanted to add just one more point. I echo completely what Ruth just said. I think on the ground, there's a lot of work to be done in terms of education and advocacy. But I also want to say that a lot of the decisions regarding Puerto Rico's future, and this goes back to previous questions, will be addressed in Washington, D.C. And so we need to do some advocacy there as well. So this is one of the reasons why, for example, the Center for the New Economy decided to open up a Washington, D.C. office, because we believe that we need to begin addressing Congress directly. We need to start addressing federal agencies directly and addressing the White House directly. And we see the CNE office as sort of like a mini embassy of sorts, where that nonprofits in Puerto Rico can go there, can bring their issues up, and we can hopefully craft a cohesive agenda for advocacy in DC. Now, our partners in this endeavor is basically the Puerto Rican diaspora in the United States. We have more Puerto Ricans in the United States, or people who identify themselves very proudly as Puerto Ricans in the United States, that we have Puerto Ricans living in Puerto Rico. And that's an army of advocates that we can leverage and tap into, so that our message resonates, especially in places where there are, votes to be gotten by congressional leaders. And so we need to also up our game in DC, we need to up our game in the diaspora, and we need to start having strategic conversations. Ruth knows all about this. She's been part of a great group of leaders that have actually built bridges between the diaspora and local communities. So I think we need to do much more of that.
Great, thanks. There's an interesting question about sort of the relationship between nonprofits or community-based organizations on the one hand, and government on the other. And how much is possible without the Commonwealth government coming along, and how much really requires a public sector role?
So I think that the government has a role, and the role of the government should be in response to the role of the population. So it's very important, if we are to continue to make strides towards a more equitable society, to hold the government not only accountable, but take over its institutions in a democratic way. If we continue to focus only on building a private non-for-profit sector, we are leaving aside the common goods and the common resources, which should be available precisely to move that agenda forward. So we believe in the Caño Martín Peña project that is critical to have institutions and government institutions that can be responsive to the needs of the population, and that there is a necessity of citizens to exercise that citizenship and their rights, and to continue to take over the institutions instead of discarding them. So we really have a lot of work in that end, and we feel that the non-for-profit sector should also contribute rather than separating both agendas, to continue to fortify the role of the citizens with regards to the state.
Great, thanks.
I think citizens groups have an amazing role to play, but I agree 100% with Livia. We can't just expect citizens group to basically take the recovery on their backs and move it forward. I think it's unfair, and I don't even think there's a place in the world where that has happened. And I think also, in a way, that we can't just stop holding neither the public sector accountable, nor can we give the recovery over to private interests. That's actually happening right now in Puerto Rico. The dismantling of the public sphere through austerity politics has greatly diminished the state's capacity to actually conduct its day-to-day operations and serve its citizens. And we've been seeing this play out since 2005 up until now. And what has taken its place is an army of private consultants and private interests that have, just descended upon Puerto Rico, providing solutions, copy and pasting them from places they've been before, from Texas, from Louisiana, from other disasters. What happens when these private armies and these private companies leave is that they take the knowledge with them. What happens when you do the recovery with a robust public sector is that knowledge is institutionalized in our public entities, and that knowledge is what we need. Come next disaster or come other crises, we can tap into that knowledge. So the public sector has a fundamental role to play in the recovery, and we shouldn't downplay it.
Maybe, Tina, that's great. Maybe expand on that just briefly. How could we improve, whether in the United States or elsewhere, future disaster responses? We've seen Katrina. We've seen a number of not so good responses. Maria being another example, unfortunately. But is there a way that we can be more effective in this work?
Yeah, I think it's interesting that the most powerful nation in the world, or so it touts itself as, is unable repeatedly to respond to big crises and emergencies. It's unable to do so, and it does really poorly, especially in poor and low-income communities. There's a pattern there somewhere, right? So this investment in poor and low-income communities breeds these crises post-disaster, right? So I think before the hurricanes, we need to start thinking about these communities, the most vulnerable ones, and start investing more resources and building the right kind of equity policy so that when a disaster comes, these communities are able and empowered, as Olivia has mentioned, as Ruth has mentioned, to respond to crises effectively. Now, again, not placing all the responsibility in the communities, but actually empowering them. Now, interestingly, for example, one way that the federal government could do this is by taking a better look at their procurement policies. We did a study at the center where we started looking at how much money was actually being contracted from federal agencies in the aftermath of Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico. And we wanted to look at the split between whether Puerto Rican companies were being tapped or hired or looked into to respond to the emergency and a year after, and what amount was given to mainland firms in the aftermath of the hurricane. And the split, surprisingly, is 90% of federal contracts is going to U.S. mainland firms or firms operating predominantly in the United States, and only 10% going to local firms. If we are not nurturing our local firm infrastructure to actually be able to respond and learn from disaster recovery and even disaster response, I think we're going to, again, commit the same mistakes of the past, because it's a small number of disaster capitalist organizations that are actually taking over the recovery. And so these are the kind of things that, ironically, the Stafford Act addresses. The Stafford Act is the matrix law for disaster recovery in the United States, and it explicitly states that whenever possible, the investment should go to local firms. But that's not happening, and it didn't happen in Katrina, and it's not happening in Puerto Rico. So we have to ask ourselves, structurally speaking, is the federal government actually following up on the rules and the regulations that it created to address these issues of disaster response?
Great, thanks. Let's see, we're running low on time. I just want to ask really quickly, it was a question from the audience, sort of, if you, and anybody can jump in quickly on this, but if you had the ear of a U.S. senator or somebody like that, what would you say? It's pretty open.
Well, what we've said with the ones we've met, especially the community groups in southeastern Puerto Rico, which are the focus of the big Central Station fossil fuel plants, is to let's see some enforcement, let's see some oversight of these plants, let's see in a private inspector general for PREPA, which is controlled by other partisan interests, and so to work in collaboration and support communities that are facing environmental justice issues, being disproportionately impacted by this fossil fuel-based system, and support the pilot projects that someone mentioned, right? So communities, we, with the resources that we can garner, are doing, the groups I work with are doing pilot, energy generation projects and environmental and energy literacy projects, but we certainly need that government funds support these efforts as well.
All right, thanks. Well, I think with that, we're going to have to call it a day. Thanks everyone for participating in this webinar and in the entire Rebuilding the Economy series. And thanks especially to my colleague Cindy Suarez, Nelson Colon from the Community Foundation of Puerto Rico, Lydia Rodriguez de Valle from Bartopenia Community Land Trust, Deepak Lambanieves from Center for New Economy, and Luz Santiago from Centro
El Puente and Comité de Diálogo
Ambiental, right? Okay, right. Sorry about that. Thanks to everyone, and again, we'll have the recordings available shortly, and please send us your ideas for what we should do in season 2 of the series. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.